A long time ago, Africa was home to many powerful kingdoms and tribes. The people had their own lands, languages, and ways of life. There was the Mali Empire, known for its gold, and the Zulu Kingdom, famous for its warriors. They traded goods like gold, ivory, and salt with others from around the world. But then, European explorers came to Africa, and the Portuguese were the first to sail around the coast. Later, the British, French, Dutch, and Spanish followed. They were all interested in Africa's rich resources. Some famous explorers, like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley, traveled deep into Africa and wrote about their adventures. When European leaders read these stories, they were eager to take control of Africa and began exploring the continent. By the 1800s, Europe had become more advanced due to the Industrial Revolution. Factories needed materials like rubber, cotton, and minerals, which Africa had in plenty. Also, European countries were competing to be the most powerful. Taking over African lands was a way to show strength. Some leaders, like King Leopold II of Belgium, were especially greedy. He wanted to take the Congo for himself. Other European nations saw this and wanted their own parts of Africa. Soon, they began fighting over land. To stop arguments and prevent war, they decided to meet and divide Africa peacefully. This led to the Berlin Conference. In November 1884, leaders from 14 European countries and the United States met in Berlin, Germany. The meeting was organized by Otto von Bismarck, the leader of Germany. But guess what? No African leaders were invited. The people who lived in Africa had no say in what happened to their land. The Europeans simply drew lines on a map, splitting Africa into colonies. They didn't care about Africa's cultures, languages, or borders. They just wanted to take as much land as possible. By 1914, almost the entire African continent was controlled by Europeans. Only Ethiopia and Liberia were not colonized. Britain took Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, and South Africa. France took most of West Africa. Germany controlled parts of East and Southwest Africa. Belgium ruled the Congo. Portugal took Angola and Mozambique. In some places, like the Congo under Belgium's King Leopold II, millions of Africans died from overwork, starvation, and violence. Leopold's rule in the Congo was particularly brutal. He forced Africans to collect rubber, and those who didn't meet their quotas were punished severely. It's estimated that up to 10 million Congolese people died during Leopold's rule. The new borders ignored African tribes, forcing different groups to live together. This would later lead to wars and conflicts. They drew straight lines on the map, splitting tribes and kingdoms. For example, the Maasai people were divided between Kenya and Tanzania, and the Somali people were split among 5 countries. European powers ruled Africa without asking Africans what they wanted. They forced Africans to work on farms and in mines for very little pay. Africans lost their land. New borders were drawn, which caused many problems later. African cultures and traditions were disrespected. Europeans brought new languages like English and French. In some places, schools, roads, and hospitals were built, but they mostly benefited the Europeans. Africans were treated as second-class citizens in their own lands. Despite these challenges, Africans did not give up. Many brave leaders and communities fought back against colonial rule. For example, in Ethiopia, Emperor Menelik II defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, keeping his country independent. In West Africa, the Ashanti people fought the British for many years. In South Africa, the Zulu warriors resisted both the British and the Dutch settlers. Despite many brave fights, most African resistance was crushed because the Europeans had better weapons. After World War II, European countries were weakened and Africa's struggle for freedom grew stronger. Africans demanded independence from these colonialists. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Nelson Mandela led movements to free their nations Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa respectively. By the 1960s, most African countries had gained independence, but the damage caused by colonization remained. The Berlin Conference left lasting problems in Africa. Unfair borders. Many African countries still struggle with ethnic conflicts because different groups were forced together. Economic problems. European countries took Africa's wealth, leaving African nations poor. Language and culture. Many African countries still use European languages like English and French. Despite these challenges, Africa remains strong. Today, many African nations are rebuilding and celebrating their rich history and culture. The Berlin Conference changed Africa forever. It brought colonialism, which caused suffering and exploitation, but it also united Africans in their fight for freedom.